The rhythmic hiss and click of the mechanical ventilators set the tempo for the night shift in the intensive care unit. It was a sterile symphony, a mechanical heartbeat that filled the cavernous room with a sense of fragile order. The air smelled sharply of bleach, rubbing alcohol, and the faint, unmistakable metallic tang of impending death. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pallid, unforgiving glare on the linoleum floors. At 2 in the morning, the hospital was a ghost ship, drifting through the dark hours where human physiology was at its most vulnerable. In this manufactured twilight, the margin between life and death was measured in millimeters of mercury and fractions of a milligram. Sarah stood at the edge of bed 4, her posture intentionally curved, her eyes downcast. She was a shadow in a pair of faded blue scrubs. Her movements were economical, almost invisible, as she adjusted a tangled nest of intravenous lines. To the casual observer, and certainly to the hospital administration, she was just another night nurse. She was quiet, she never argued, and she blended into the background with the practiced ease of someone who desperately wanted to be forgotten. She was 32, though the faint lines around her eyes suggested a lifetime of exhaustion. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight, utilitarian bun, secured with a plain black band. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, nothing that could catch the light or draw the eye. But beneath the oversized scrubs, her muscles were coiled like high-tensile wire. If one looked closely, and no one ever did, they might notice the way she moved. There was no wasted motion. Her balance was perfectly centered, shifting seamlessly from the balls of her feet to her heels. When she checked the pulse, her fingers didn't just search for a beat. They mapped the vein, assessed the pressure, and calculated the volume of blood flow in a fraction of a second. She didn't just look at the cardiac monitors. She absorbed the data, reading the jagged green lines not as abstract shapes, but as a deeply familiar language. Underneath her left cuff, hidden from the harsh fluorescent lights, a jagged starburst-shaped scar wrapped around her forearm. It was a souvenir from a lifetime ago, a remnant of a world built on dust, cordite, and the deafening roar of rotor blades. It was a memory of a time when her name was whispered with reverence in the darkest corners of the globe. But here, in the sterile corridors of the VA hospital, she was just Sarah, the shy nurse, the one who took the worst shifts and the hardest cases without a word of complaint. She adjusted the drip rate on the saline bag, her fingers moving with a terrifying, unthinking speed, snapping the plastic roller clamp into place before her conscious mind even registered the action. She stopped, froze, and forced herself to slow down. She took a deep breath, deliberately making her movements clumsier, more hesitant. She had to remember the mask. The mask kept her safe. The mask kept the memories at bay. Footsteps echoed down the long corridor. They were loud, arrogant, and entirely out of place in the hushed reverence of the ICU. It sounded like someone marching on a parade ground, rather than walking through a ward of critically ill patients. Sarah didn't need to look up to know who it was. The heavy, measured tread belonged to Dr. Eris Thorne. Thorne was the attending physician for the night shift, a man whose ego entered the room a full 3 seconds before his physical body. He was tall, impeccably groomed, and wore a pristine white coat that looked as though it had never seen a drop of sweat or blood. He carried a tablet like a shield, a digital barrier between himself and the messy, unpredictable reality of human suffering. Thorne was a creature of protocol, a man who believed that medicine was a series of algorithms to be memorized and executed from a position of absolute authority. He did not treat patients, he managed cases. He stopped at the foot of bed 4, his eyes fixed on the tablet in his hands rather than the pale, shivering man lying beneath the thin hospital blanket. He tapped the screen with a manicured finger, sighing heavily as if the very existence of the patient was a personal inconvenience. "Nurse," Thorne snapped, his voice sharp and carrying too far in the quiet room. He didn't use her name. He rarely did. "Why is the potassium drip running at this rate? The protocol clearly states a different titration schedule for post-operative thoracic patients." Sarah kept her head down, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "His renal output dropped over the last hour, doctor. I adjusted the drip to compensate for the decreased clearance, as per the secondary guidelines for acute kidney injury." Thorne finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. He looked at her as if she were a particularly stubborn stain on the floor. "You adjusted it. A nurse adjusted the protocol without consulting the attending physician. Do you have a medical degree that I am unaware of, or do you just enjoy playing doctor in the middle of the night? Sarah felt a familiar coldness settle behind her ribs, a disciplined, icy calm that had once kept her alive in places where the sky rained fire. She pushed it down. She let her shoulders slump a fraction of an inch. No, doctor, one apologize. I will return it to the baseline rate. See that you do, Thorne said, his tone dripping with condescension. Your job is to follow orders, not to interpret them. We have protocols for a reason. They prevent uneducated mistakes. If you cannot follow simple instructions, perhaps you are not suited for the intensive care unit. Understood, doctor, Sarah murmured. Thorne scoffed, turning on his heel. Just make sure the new admission is prepped. Colonel Vance. He's coming up from surgery in 10 minutes. Coronary artery bypass graft, complicated by a previous chest trauma. It's a high-profile case. The base commander is a personal friend of his. I do not want any of your improvisations on my patient. You will monitor him, you will record his vitals, and you will page me if anything deviates from the expected parameters. Is that clear? Yes, doctor. Thorne marched away, the crisp fabric of his coat swishing with self-importance. Sarah watched him go, her expression blank. She reached out and adjusted the potassium drip back to Thorne's ordered rate, knowing with absolute, clinical certainty that it would cause the patient's heart to throw premature ventricular contractions within the hour. She would have to stand by with a syringe of lidocaine to fix the doctor's mistake when it inevitably happened. It was the dance she performed every night. She was the invisible safety net beneath a tightrope walker who believed he could fly. From across the nursing station, Maggie watched the exchange. Maggie was a veteran of the ward, a senior charge nurse with silver hair, a sharp tongue, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She had been working in intensive care units since before Thorne was born, and she possessed a deep, instinctual understanding of the people who inhabited her world. She walked over to Sarah, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the tile. He's a paper tiger, honey, Maggie said softly, leaning against the counter. Loud roar, tears easily in the rain. Sarah offered a small, non-committal smile, keeping her focus on the monitor. He's the attending, Maggie. He gives the orders. Maggie studied Sarah's profile. You know, in 30 years I've seen a lot of nurses come and go. I've seen the terrified ones, the arrogant ones, the ones who burn out in 6 months. But you. Maggie paused, her gaze dropping to the way Sarah's hands rested on the edge of the bed rail. They weren't resting, they were hovering, perfectly balanced, ready to strike. You're something else entirely. You act like a mouse, but you watch the room like a hawk. You don't just see the monitors, you see the spaces between the beats. I just do my job, Maggie, Sarah said, her voice entirely devoid of inflection. Uh-huh, Maggie replied, clearly unconvinced. Just remember, hiding in the shadows might keep you safe from the idiot doctors, but it doesn't do the patients any good when the real fire starts. And this place? It's a powder keg wrapped in red tape. Eventually, a spark is going to catch. Before Sarah could respond, the heavy double doors of the ICU swung open. The transport team wheeled in a bed surrounded by a chaotic tangle of IV poles, portable monitors, and oxygen tanks. At the center of the mechanical tempest lay Colonel Thomas Vance. He was a large man, his chest wrapped in thick white bandages that were already blooming with faint pink shadows of blood. His face was gray, his skin clammy and pale under the harsh lights. An endotracheal tube protruded from his mouth, connected to a portable ventilator that forced air into his compromised lungs with a mechanical hiss. He looked less like a soldier and more like a broken machine, held together by plastic tubing and chemical prayers. Sarah moved immediately, her shy demeanor vanishing for a split second as she took control of the transfer. She didn't wait for the transport nurses to give the handover. Her eyes were already scanning the lines, tracing the chest tubes, noting the volume of dark, thick blood in the collection chamber. She moved with a fluid, blinding speed, transferring the heavy monitor cables from the transport unit to the wall unit, her hands a blur of calculated motion. On my count, Sarah said, her voice suddenly authoritative, cutting through the chatter of the transport team. 1, 2, 3. They shifted the massive man onto the ICU bed. Sarah was already hanging the new bags of pressors, her eyes darting to the arterial line waveform on the central monitor. The wave was sluggish, the peak rounded. His blood pressure was dangerously soft. Thorne materialized at the foot of the bed, his tablet in hand. All right, let's get him settled. Standard post-op CABG protocol. Keep his mean arterial pressure above 65. Titrate the norepinephrine as needed. I want a chest X-ray in 1 hour. Sarah finished securing the endotracheal tube, her fingers lingering on the colonel's neck for a fraction of a second. His skin was cool and his pulse was steady, a weak, frantic fluttering against her fingertips. She looked at the chest tube drainage system. It was bubbling, a steady rhythmic percolation that shouldn't be there. Dr. Thorne, Sarah said, her voice low. His chest tube output is increasing. The fluid is bright red, not serosanguinous, and there is a continuous air leak in the water seal chamber. Thorne didn't even look up from his screen. He just had his chest cracked open, nurse. Bleeding is expected. The air leak is likely from a small parenchymal tear. It will seal itself. Follow the protocol. Monitor the output. His central venous pressure is rising, but his arterial pressure is dropping, Sarah persisted, taking a half step toward Thorne. The waveform on the arterial line is showing pulsus paradoxus. His systolic pressure drops by more than 10 millimeters of mercury with every mechanical breath. That's indicative of… I know what it is indicative of, Thorne snapped, his voice echoing in the quiet unit. Heads turned from the other base. Maggie stopped halfway across the room, her eyes narrowing. It is indicative of a patient who has just undergone massive trauma to the myocardium. His heart is stunned. The pressors will support his pressure until the tissue recovers. Thorne stepped closer to Sarah, towering over her, using his physical size to enforce his authority. Do not attempt to diagnose my patients. You are reading a monitor. I am reading the entire clinical picture. You lack the education to understand the nuances of postoperative hemodynamics. Do your job. Record the numbers. If his pressure drops below 60, increase the drip. That is all. Sarah looked at Thorne. For a moment the mask slipped. Her eyes, usually kept wide and carefully vacant, went flat and dead. It was the look of a predator assessing a threat and finding it entirely lacking in substance. It was the look of someone who had seen men blown to pieces, who had held sleek, beating hearts in her bare hands while mortar fire rained down around her. Thorne saw the look, and for a microsecond he faltered. A flicker of genuine unease crossed his perfectly manicured features, but his arrogance quickly swallowed it. He sneered, turned, and walked back to the safety of the nurse's station, sitting heavily in the leather chair and opening a medical journal. Sarah turned back to the colonel. The switch had flipped. The quiet, shy nurse was gone, buried beneath layers of intense, focused, tactical awareness. She was back in the zone. The hospital walls faded away, replaced by the chaotic, hyper-real clarity of a combat triage center. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor was no longer an annoyance. It was a countdown timer. She began to prepare her station. She didn't do it visibly. She moved with deliberate slowness, looking like she was merely tidying up, but every action was calculated. She positioned the crash cart exactly 3 feet from the head of the bed, ensuring the wheels were unlocked and facing outward. She subtly rearranged the drawers, moving the large bore needles, the scalpel blades, and the betadine swabs to the very front. She drew up a massive dose of epinephrine and concealed the syringe beneath a sterile towel on the bedside table. She was building a defensive perimeter, preparing for an assault that only she knew was coming. 30 minutes passed. The ICU was quiet, save for the mechanical breathing of the ventilators. Thorne was asleep in his chair, his head resting against the glass partition. Sarah stood perfectly still at the foot of Colonel Vance's bed. She was watching the monitor, but she wasn't looking at the numbers. She was looking at the geometry of the waveforms. The green line of the electrocardiogram was becoming subtly disorganized. The QRS complexes were shrinking, becoming smaller and narrower. Electrical alternance. The electrical signal of the heart was shifting, struggling to push through an increasing volume of fluid surrounding the muscle. She looked at the chest tube. The bubbling had stopped. The drainage had stopped. It wasn't because the bleeding had ceased. It was because the tube was clotted. The blood was no longer draining out of his chest. It was pooling inside, filling the pericardial sac, crushing the heart under immense, inescapable pressure. Cardiac tamponade. The heart was drowning in its own blood, unable to expand, unable to pump. At the same time, the injured lung, leaking air into the pleural space, was expanding like a balloon. Tension pneumothorax. The pressure in the chest cavity was rising exponentially, shifting the trachea, collapsing the good lung, and kinking the superior vena cava. No blood was getting to the heart, no blood was getting to the brain. It was a catastrophic dual system failure, a death spiral that protocol could not fix. The central monitor began to alarm. It wasn't the soft, rhythmic ding of a minor variation. It was the harsh, continuous, piercing shriek of a critical failure. The red lights flashed, casting a hellish glow over the pale skin of the colonel. "Code Blue, Bed 4. Code Blue, Bed 4, the automated voice announced over the overhead speakers. The ICU erupted into motion. Nurses sprinted from their stations. Maggie was there in an instant, her hands already reaching for the manual resuscitation bag. Thorne jolted awake, his tablet clattering to the floor. He scrambled to his feet, his pristine white coat flying behind him as he ran to the bed. He looked at the monitor, his eyes wide, his face suddenly drained of color. The numbers were plummeting. Blood pressure, 40 over palp. Heart rate, 140. But the waveform was a chaotic, useless flutter. Oxygen saturation, falling rapidly into the 70s. "What happened?" Thorne yelled, his voice cracking with panic. The calm, authoritative facade shattered instantly, revealing the terrified, inexperienced man beneath. He had never seen a patient crash this fast, this violently. "What did you do?" he demanded, pointing a trembling finger at Sarah. "His chest tube clotted," Sarah said, her voice entirely devoid of panic. It was a flat, hard, tactical report. "He is in acute cardiac tamponade and tension pneumothorax. He has no venous return. His heart is empty." "Push epi, push a milligram of epinephrine," Thorne shouted, staring helplessly at the monitor. "Start chest compressions." "Compressions will not work," Sarah stated, her voice cutting through the rising panic in the room like a scalpel through soft tissue. "His heart is being crushed by fluid. Pushing on his chest will only increase the pressure. You need to decompress the chest and drain the pericardium, now." "Do not tell me what to do," Thorne screamed, sweat beading on his forehead. He grabbed the manual resuscitator bag from Maggie and began squeezing it frantically, forcing air into the colonel's lungs. "We follow the ACLS protocol. Push the epi, shock him." "He is in pulseless electrical activity," Sarah said, stepping closer to Thorne. "You cannot shock PEA, and forcing positive pressure ventilation into a tension pneumothorax is going to kill him faster. You are increasing the intrathoracic pressure." Thorne froze. He stood at the head of the bed, the plastic bag in his hands, staring blindly at the flatlining monitor. The machine was screaming. The colonel's face was turning a deep, horrifying shade of blue. His jugular veins were distended, bulging like thick ropes against his neck. The established authority figure had completely, catastrophically failed. His brain, reliant on flowcharts and memorized steps, had encountered an unscripted nightmare, and it simply shut down. He was a paper tiger who had finally seen his first real fire, and he was burning to ash. "Do something!" Maggie yelled at Thorne, her experienced eyes recognizing the imminent death. "Decompress his chest!" Thorne opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His hands shook violently. He took a step backward, away from the bed, away from the dying man. He was paralyzed. Sarah looked at Thorne, then at the dying colonel. The hesitation, the fear of exposure, the desire to remain invisible, it all vanished in a microsecond. The shy night nurse ceased to exist. She moved. It was a movement born of muscle memory, forged in the crucible of war. She didn't walk, she flowed around the bed, her presence suddenly commanding, heavy, and terrifyingly focused. She reached out and physically shoved Dr. Thorne out of the way. She didn't push him gently. She hit him with the heel of her hand against his shoulder, sending the taller man stumbling backward into a wall of IV pumps. "Get out of the way," Sarah commanded. Her voice was unrecognizable. It was low, hard, and imbued with an unshakable, absolute authority. It was a voice used to giving orders over the sound of incoming artillery. The room froze. Maggie stared. The other nurses stopped in their tracks. Even the screaming monitor seemed to fade into the background. Sarah didn't wait for permission. She reached beneath the sterile towel she had placed earlier and retrieved a massive 14-gauge angiocatheter needle. She didn't bother with betadine, there was no time. She found the second intercostal space on the colonel's right chest, mid-clavicular line, using just her thumb and forefinger to map the ribs in a fraction of a second. She drove the needle into the chest wall with brutal, calculated force. There was a loud, audible hiss, a rush of trapped air escaping under immense pressure, smelling of blood and stale oxygen. The tensioned pneumothorax was decompressed. Instantly, the colonel's trachea, which had been pushed to the left, snapped back toward the center of his throat. "Syringe, large bore," Sarah barked, her hand already extending backward without looking. Maggie, snapping out of her shock, moved with the speed of a seasoned veteran. She slapped a 60cc syringe into Sarah's waiting hand. "Scalpel," Sarah demanded. Another nurse handed her a number 11 blade. Sarah didn't look at Thorne, who was staring in wide-eyed horror from the corner of the room. She was entirely focused on the landscape of the colonel's chest. The air was out, but the heart was still drowning. She needed to perform a pericardiocentesis, a blind, highly dangerous procedure usually done under ultrasound guidance in a calm environment. She was going to do it by feel, on a dying man, in a matter of seconds. She found the xiphoid process at the base of the sternum. She made a tiny, precise nick in the skin with the scalpel, just enough to allow the needle to pass without dragging. She attached the massive syringe to a spinal needle. "Hold this pressure," Sarah ordered Maggie. She inserted the needle at a 45-degree angle, aiming upward toward the left shoulder. The room held its breath. The silence was thick, heavy, suffocating. Sarah closed her eyes for a split second, relying entirely on the tactile feedback traveling up the metal shaft of the needle. She felt it push through the subcutaneous fat, slip past the tough cartilage of the ribs, and then a distinct, subtle pop. She had pierced the pericardial sac. If she pushed 1 millimeter further, she would puncture the myocardium, the heart muscle itself, and kill him instantly. She held the needle dead steady, her hand as solid as carved stone. With her other hand, she pulled back on the plunger of the syringe. Dark, thick, unoxygenated blood flooded into the plastic barrel. 10 continuant, 20, 40. She was pulling the deadly pressure of the heart. "Empty it," Sarah commanded, detaching the full syringe and handing it to Maggie, leaving the needle perfectly positioned in the chest. Maggie handed her a fresh syringe, and Sarah reattached it, pulling another 60 cubic centimeters of blood from the sac. Suddenly, the monitor changed pitch. The chaotic, useless flutter of the PEA rhythm snapped into a sharp, distinct sinus tachycardia. The heart, freed from its watery prison, bounded back to life, pumping furiously to make up for lost time. "Blood pressure is coming up," one of the nurses called out, her voice trembling with adrenaline and awe. 60/40, 80/50. It's holding. The colonel gasped, a harsh, ragged intake of breath against the ventilator. His eyes fluttered beneath his closed lids. The blue tint receded from his face, replaced by a pale, flushed pink. Sarah didn't relax. She maintained her grip on the needle, securing it with a surgical clamp to ensure it didn't shift. "Maggie, prep a pericardial drain kit. We need to leave a catheter in place. Page the cardiothoracic surgeon on call. Tell him we have a stabilized tamponade post-CABG, and he needs to get down here to revise the chest tubes." "Right away," Maggie said, her voice filled with a newfound profound respect. She looked at Sarah not as a shy night nurse, but as a commander on a battlefield. The immediate danger neutralized, the adrenaline began to ebb, leaving behind a heavy vibrating silence in the ICU. The machines returned to the rhythmic steady hum. The scent of blood was strong in the air. Thorne slowly pushed himself off the wall. His pristine coat was crumpled, his hair disheveled. He looked at the blood on Sarah's gloves, at the needle protruding from the colonel's chest, at the monitor showing a strong, steady heartbeat. He looked like a man who had just watched the laws of physics be rewritten in front of his eyes. "You," Thorne stammered, his voice weak, devoid of its usual booming resonance. "You punctured his chest. You performed a blind pericardiocentesis. You have no authorization. You could have killed him." Sarah finally turned to look at him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. "He was dead, Dr. Thorne. Protocol killed him. I brought him back." Before Thorne could formulate a response, the heavy doors of the ICU crashed open again. A man in dark green surgical scrubs strode in, flanked by 2 military police officers. He was older, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. He was Dr. Elias Vance, the chief of trauma surgery and the colonel's younger brother. He took one look at the scene, the blood, the decompressed chest, the needle clamped perfectly in place and Thorn trembling in the corner. Then his eyes landed on Sarah. He stopped dead. The anger and urgency in his posture evaporated, replaced by absolute shock. "Ghost actual?" Dr. Vance whispered, the military call sign slipping from his lips before he could stop it. Sarah stiffened, her posture locking into a perfect, rigid attention. "Sir." Thorn looked between the chief of surgery and the shy night nurse, his mind failing to process the interaction. "Dr. Vance," Thorn sputtered, trying to regain a sliver of authority. "This nurse, she went rogue. She assaulted me. She performed an unauthorized, highly dangerous surgical procedure on your brother. I demand she be terminated immediately." Dr. Vance ignored Thorn completely. He walked slowly toward Sarah, his eyes tracing the line of the needle, the perfect placement of the decompression, the absolute terrifying competence of the setup. "A blind stick, Sarah?" Vance asked softly, his voice full of wonder. "With a spinal needle? In a poorly lit ICU?" "The anatomy doesn't change because the lights are dim, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady, though her hands were beginning to tremble with the massive adrenaline crash. Vance let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. He turned to Thorn and his eyes grew cold, hard and unforgiving. "Dr. Thorn, do you have any idea who you are talking to?" Thorn swallowed hard. "She's a staff nurse, Dr. Vance." "She," Vance said, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "is Sergeant First Class Sarah Jenkins, former Special Operations Combat Medic, Delta Force Detachment. She spent 4 years pulling shattered men out of burning helicopters in the Hindu Kush. She has performed more field surgeries under hostile fire than you have performed appendectomies in a sterile operating room. If she pushed you out of the way, Thorn, it was because you were standing in the way of a life being saved." The silence in the room was absolute. The other nurses stared at Sarah, their mouths slightly open. Maggie smiled, a slow, fiercely proud smile. She had known there was a tiger hiding in the grass. Thorn's face turned the color of old ash. His arrogance, built on titles, protocols, and a pristine white coat, shattered completely against the bedrock reality of true, earned competence. He looked at Sarah, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the way she stood, the way she observed the room, the terrifying stillness that masked a lethal efficiency. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that he had been trying to teach a master how to hold the tool. I was following protocol," Thorn whispered, a pathetic defense that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Protocol is a map for those who don't know the territory, Doctor," Vance said sharply. "When the map fails, you need a guide who can navigate in the dark. You froze. She didn't. Go to my office, Thorn. Wait for me there. We are going to have a very long conversation about your future at this hospital." Thorn didn't argue. He couldn't. He stripped off his white coat, suddenly finding it heavy and suffocating, and walked out of the ICU, a broken, humbled man. He was a paper tiger who had been entirely consumed by the fire. Vance turned back to Sarah. He reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a gesture of immense respect, of shared trauma, of profound gratitude. "You saved my brother, Ghost. Thank you." Sarah looked at the floor, the old instinct to hide warring with the new reality of her exposure. But then she looked up. She looked at the monitor, at the strong, steady heartbeat of the man she had pulled back from the abyss. She looked at Maggie, who was giving her a subtle nod of encouragement. "Just doing my job, sir," Sarah said, but this time the words weren't empty. They were full of weight, of truth, of a quiet, unshakable pride. The aftermath of the crisis was a slow, deliberate unwinding of tension. The cardiothoracic team arrived, taking over the scene with a flurry of organized activity. They replaced Sarah's improvised drain with a formal chest tube, marveling at the precision of her initial needle placement. The surgeon, a haughty man who usually dismissed nurses entirely, made a point to find Sarah before he left, shaking her hand and thanking her for preserving the myocardial tissue. Sarah retreated to the break room. The adrenaline had finally washed out of her system, leaving her limbs feeling like lead and her mind echoing with the ghosts of the past. She sat in a cheap plastic chair, staring at her hands. They were trembling now, a fine, uncontrollable tremor. She had spent 2 years trying to forget the feeling of blood on her gloves, the desperate, frantic race against time, the terrible responsibility of holding a human life in her hands. She had hidden herself in the quiet, routine monotony of the night shift, hoping that if she made herself small enough, the memories wouldn't be able to find her. But the fire had found her anyway, and when it did, she hadn't burned. She had forged something new. The door opened softly, and Maggie walked in. She carried 2 cups of terrible hospital coffee, setting one down on the table in front of Sarah. Maggie sat opposite her, not speaking for a long time. She just let the silence stretch out, a comfortable, safe space in the wake of the storm. "You know," Maggie finally said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee, "I always knew you were hiding something. I just thought it was a bad breakup or a mean ex-husband. I didn't realize I was working with a certified badass." Sarah managed a weak, exhausted smile. "I'm not a badass, Maggie. I'm just a medic who couldn't leave the war behind." "Honey, look at me," Maggie commanded, her voice softening. Sarah raised her eyes. "You didn't bring the war here. You brought the skills that survived it. There is a difference. You've been walking around here like a ghost, apologizing for taking up space. But tonight you were the most real thing in that room. You saved the man because you refused to let protocol dictate his death. You stepped into the light." Sarah looked down at her arm. She reached over and slowly, deliberately, rolled up the sleeve of her oversized scrub top, exposing the jagged, starburst scar. She traced the raised tissue with her fingertip. It didn't feel like a brand of shame anymore. It felt like a map of where she had been, a testament to what she had endured. "It's loud in the light," Sarah whispered. "It is," Maggie agreed. "But it's where you belong. You can't put the tiger back in the grass once everyone has seen its stripes. And frankly, we need you out here. We need people who know what to do when the machines fail and the doctors freeze." The morning light began to filter through the small window in the break room, casting a pale golden glow over the sterile linoleum. The shift was ending. The day staff would soon arrive, bringing with them a new wave of noise, activity, and routine. But the status quo of the ICU had been fundamentally fractured and rebuilt. Dr. Thorne was gone, indefinitely suspended pending a massive review of his clinical decisions. The whispers of the night shift had already become the legends of the morning shift. The story of the quiet nurse who had physically moved an attending physician to save a coding colonel was spreading through the hospital like wildfire. Sarah stood up, stretching her aching back. She walked out of the break room and down the corridor toward bed 4. The coroner was resting peacefully, his vitals stable, his color good. His brother, Dr. Vance, was sitting in a chair beside the bed, asleep, his head resting on his hand. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, no longer slouching, no longer trying to blend into the machinery. She stood tall, her posture relaxed but perfectly balanced. She checked the monitor, not with the frightened compliance of a subordinate, but with the critical, authoritative eye of a seasoned professional. She saw the steady rhythm of the heart she had rescued. She realized then that survival was not the same as healing. Hiding in the shadows had kept her alive, but it had prevented her from living. She had been terrified that if she showed her true self, she would be rejected, feared, or misunderstood. But the opposite had happened. By revealing her hidden strength, she had found vindication. She had found a place where her past and her present could finally integrate. The bravest act is not running into the fire. It is standing in the light of day and showing the world exactly who you are, scars and all. True competence is quiet, but it is never invisible. It waits, patient and resolute, for the moment when the loud, fragile arrogance of the world inevitably shatters. And when the system fails, when the protocols crumble, it is the quiet professionals who step forward to hold the line. They do not seek the spotlight, but they do not shrink from it when a life is on the line. Sarah turned away from the bed and walked toward the nurse's station to clock out. She didn't walk softly. Her footsteps were deliberate, grounded, and sure. The shy night nurse was gone. the Delta medic had returned, and the hospital would never be the same.